usual hosts, me, Professor Howard Williams, and her.
Afnan and hello.
That was almost sort of my radio DJ introduction. I hope it works. But hello, everybody. And hello, Afnan. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, I'm great. How are you?
All right, although this topic is triggering and upsetting and traumatizing because we're going to talk about the archaeology of a very recent phenomenon. And I'm very excited to do this. I think it's very important that we do this, but equally, just to warn folks, this is going to be about the COVID-19 pandemic, its material cultures and its landscapes. And we're going to try and review two recent academic publications. Now, for context, archaeology is about the study of material remains of human societies, and that can be from the prehistoric past, or it can be from yesterday. And while archaeology has traditionally focused on pre-20th century topics, over the last 35 years or so, we've seen the birth of what's called contemporary archaeology, and overlapping with contemporary history, how we can look at the 20th century, recent events, and evaluate them as and what they tell us about broader patterns in the human past and also in their own right. So we're going to try and reflect on some of the new literature coming out on COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns. And we want to focus on, there's actually quite a lot of literature looking at the heritage impact, how people try to use monuments and landscapes to gain benefit, but also to look at the environmental pollution, the archaeological trace of the pandemic lockdown, not only in terms of human deaths, but also hospitals, public spaces, private spaces too. So we're going to look at two papers. The first one is published in the Journal of Contemporary Archaeology for 2021, volume 8, part 1, pages 154 to 184. And it's by Dante Angelo, Kelly M. Britt, Margaret Lou Brown and Stacey L. Camp, and it's called Private Struggles in Public Spaces, documenting COVID-19 material culture and landscapes. Right, that's an archaeologist's paper, and we're going to compare that with a historian, Dr. Cara Critchell of our own Department of History and Archaeology at the University of Chester, and her paper is in an edited book, an edited collection, and it's called Disrupting the Rituals of Grief, Conflict, COVID-19 and the Fracturing of Funerary Tradition. And this came out in 2021 too. And I'll put details of both papers in the description and where you can find them online. But this is from a historian's perspective on the COVID-19 background, and particularly a modern historian's perspective. So, I mean, this is what's your take on these papers, Afnan? What did you get out of them, or what did you feel was the most takeaway points people?
I think they both have, I mean, of course, it's very similar themes. We're talking about COVID-19, but they do overlap in some cases. And I think reading them both, it was really interesting because they both start talking about how, well, of course, how COVID has related to everybody in their daily lives and how people are coping with, be it death, for example, and how it relates to how the government is dealing with the deaths of COVID, but also they combine to really talk about space and how people are using I guess space effectively or ineffectively, however you see it. And I think that that's really important because I think on a social level, I think everybody, our listeners, but even anyone else living in around the world, everyone has been affected by COVID due to social interactions and how it hasn't, or lack of social interaction even. And I think both papers really do address this. And I think that is a really important part, both archaeologically, but historically as well. So yeah, how about you? What do you think you're like,
I must admit, during the pandemic lockdown, I was too busy trying to do my own thing, but I was out and about recording how people, signs and material culture were affecting the landscape. And I did some blogs in relation to that. And I particularly waded in on one issue, namely the closure of cemeteries and churchyards, which I said was, I actually made some strong opinions about how that was done and how it went about and the effects it may have had on people's access to green spaces, to to spaces of mourning, remembrance, and of just general leisure, which cemeteries and crematoria are, as well as places where people are actually going to funerals. And this has been a major disruption in our traditional modes of grief, engagement with dead, and engagement with the outdoors. So I did have my opinions, but about these papers, I'm deeply frustrated by the academic responses to this pandemic. During the pandemic, there was all the usual big mouths trying to make it about them and their research. So if you happen to have done anything to do with a past disease, a past society, you make some hot take parallel. Oh, this is exactly what happened in 3rd century BCE Greece, or this is what happened in medieval Europe in the 14th century. And I found a lot of that gratuitous, grandstanding, and frankly, ethically problematic. But I see that it was an important moment for conversations about past pandemics, influenza pandemic of the early 20th century, cholera in the 19th century, bubonic plague, or whenever, but I did see the merit of it, bringing forward the conversation about how past societies dealt with this. But I was actually more interested in the actual archaeology and heritage. How is this affecting people's access and engagement with it? And how can we record it? How can we be, as Schofield and Harrison say in their book on the contemporary past, how can we as archaeologists be material witness onto this phenomenon? Not only the phenomenon itself, but its potential long-term legacies. How do we pick up the pieces and put it together, not only about how societies work, but how we mourn our dead, how we engage with the dead. As a mortuary archaeologist, that was my particular angle. So at one level, I'm really excited that there is now a burgeoning literature. But at another level, I think all of it is very preliminary and very it's interesting, but it's not there yet. And I think people have been sort of but some of it's very powerful. So these papers, I think, are the best of a mixed bunch, and I think they're both very powerful papers in themselves. But equally, I can see how further work can build on them, as always. So I'm not frustrated with these particular papers. I think these are really important. It's important we're getting these publications coming out about plastic pollution resulting from the pandemic, on heritage sites and their fortunes, the heritage industry, and also just general material cultures of the pandemic and its aftermath. But for me, these are the most poignant papers, whereas I feel others are, I'm not quite so clear how they're going. But yeah, I mean, so that's my general sense of the whole situation. I think there's going to be more interesting stuff coming out.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I totally feel where you're coming from, but I think not necessarily that they feel unfinished, because they don't, but it does seem like more research can be done. But then again, is the pandemic technically over? I mean, I guess now that we're talking about it.
Well, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like, is it over? Is it not? And I think as archaeologists, I mean, not always, but like personally, like prehistoric archaeology, it's finished, it's done, the border, like the chapter has been closed. So there is an end to that. Whereas I think with COVID, it's kind of like lingering, and it hasn't, like, the book hasn't been finished just yet. So we're kind of like in between these stages where we haven't really seen the aftermath of what happens after COVID, and we're just looking at what's happening during COVID. So
a lot of people have latched onto this and are doing projects that I know are not finished. So I know people, I asked about this because I knew we were going to do this podcast, and I know people that simply, because of the pandemic, some people found the pandemic an advantage of being able to be extra productive by being at home. But a lot of people who have childcare issues, who have financial issues, who are trying to juggle multiple commitments, found that the pandemic a living hell, and their careers are still in pieces trying to catch up. So I know a lot of the people actually committed to doing research on the pandemic are still trying to start collating the data they recorded by contemporary archaeological digital photography, video, interview. They haven't yet published it yet. So I think some of the better work is still to come. But I think there's going to be a lot of publications on this. It's going to be up for both on the history side and the archaeology side. I mean, about these two papers in particular, it's quite clear that the Angelo and paper, Private Struggles in Public Spaces, is really a literature review of some of the key ethical and theoretical ideas about the ethics, about what constitutes COVID-19 heritage, and the political intersections, because and talks about a lot of those the private public divide, the inequalities that came out, the links to other movements like the Black Lives Matter movements. And it's really not the results of the project. They've got a little photo essay at the end which surveys some of the images of things that they're discussing, how authorities try to impose regulations through signage and barriers and structures, but also how people express their gratitude, their anxiety, their thanks to key workers, essential workers, and the traces in the landscape of masks and sanitizer dispensers and in Chile, and they have multiple case study sites, which I think is really important. Is when this project does get produced, I think one of the strengths of their study is they're looking at multiple groups, they're multiple archaeologists working in different cities, different continents, and looking at graffiti, looking at public art, looking at barrier signs to stop people going in playgrounds, all the manner of things put up by authorities and all the things put up by the people to react. So a sign saying Trump is the virus, and other people blaming Fauci for the lockdown regulations, so range across the political spectrum, people using the pandemic. And that's something I have addressed in my Offa's Dyke collaboratory paper from the year before last, because I saw how Offa's Dyke as a monument in the landscape and a 1,000-year-old linear earthwork was being politicized in the media, but also in the landscape as a sort of proxy for the border of England and Wales with different differential lockdowns. So I see a lot in what they're doing that I also recognize I've captured, but they're doing it as a proper project, but it's not finished yet. But I thought it was good, but it sets up a lot of the theory, but it's not really accessible in terms of communicating what their results are. It's really about setting up some of the theoretical sort of apparatus with which their project happens.
I was going to say, with the Angela paper, I do think that it's very, to be honest, I actually found it very relatable. And I like that they have so many different connections with so many different countries and different cities around the world, because I do think that it really shows how COVID influenced, or I guess impacted everywhere in different ways, but also in similar ways as well. And I think I really liked the part where they were talking about, because you were actually just touching up on this, about people working from home and how difficult that has been, and how people have had to maybe pick up new roles or continue old roles that maybe they weren't a fan of, maybe women back at home. It kind of, you're working from home, but you're also doing the housewife job as well, and that really is a really tough thing to do. But not just that, men picking up work as well, housework that is, and it really does create a different atmosphere. No one's supposed to be at home 24/7. That's not comfortable. That's not mentally pleasing at all for anybody. And it really does make a really big impact. So I liked the paper is the beginning of something. So I think that's important.
And I really liked their discussions, their structured sort of questions, how they're sort of following their very, sort of very much like we encourage undergraduate and master's dissertations, posing questions, answering them. So they're, I like the way they structured, but they're also, I think, as with always, the challenge is so much of the suffering and the experience is intangible. It's not about the signs or the discard. It's not about, my home may have changed very little other than the movement of a desk here and there, but the impact has been massive. And we've always, as archaeologists, we've got to be aware that the people putting up the crazy signs are going to be the minority, or the people who have, I have talked to some academics that, oh, it's been a joy, I've just been able to sit at home and have a relaxing time. And I'm just, in my head, I'm just going, you bastard, you bastard, you bastard. And I think it really depends on if you are married, if you're not married, or you're in a relationship. Do you have access to anybody? Can you talk to anyone? I've met people who are absolutely isolated, were absolutely isolated, who gave up so much. And then when we've had in the UK, our government basically laughing in our face, and the story of how they abused the lockdowns and partied through the lockdowns. And we're all supposed to just forgive and forget that, when actually it's not only deeply personally insulting, it's grotesque. And I think that, but I'm just ranting now, but I think the point is that there is, when we think about what are the material traces of the pandemic, a lot of it is going to be immaterial. I remember visiting a closed crematorium and you know, where people were allowed to die and be burnt, but you could only have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or whatever it was, people at the ceremony. And it felt horrible, because that it's the same. The space had a few extra signs, and you know, managed. You know, there's a few extra,
Is it?
but it was just the utter ghost town feel of a space that, even if it's about death, it's a space where there's always, you know, it's a public amenity where you can go where you want, leave flowers, or but it felt, you felt under scrutiny. You felt like you might suddenly be criticized, or so there's all sorts of, you know, senses of anxiety. I remember meeting one when in the middle of the first lockdown. I remember meeting this old man in a snicket, and he was walking his dog, and he looked up at me shocked, because we were going to walk close to each other because there was no other thing to do, and he retreated like about 5 steps into a corner, like I had a gun to him. And I went, "It's all right, mate. So I'm just going to go here." And I assured him that I wasn't going to go close to him. And he went, and he just blurted out, because at the time we were only allowed one
1 hour
mode
a
of
day.
exercise, 1 hour a day. And he just blurted out, almost like a confession to a priest, "This is my second time out today.
Oh,
I needed to take the dog out again." Almost like a confession. And I wasn't wearing anything that made him think I was a policeman or anything, but the fear that he, you know, it was. So I
sad.
see, while I'm not one of those libertarian, anti-vaxxers, anti-mask people, I did see how it was affecting people, the fear it instilled, the panic it instilled in people who are vulnerable, and how callous that was, as
Gosh.
well as the people who flagrantly breached the rules were being callous too. There's a lot of, it brought out the best in people and the worst in people, and I don't think all of that will show in the material culture. I suppose that's always the truth of archaeology. We can't pick up those things, and so I suppose the material culture only takes you so far.
Yeah, and I think, but that's actually, it's so interesting because, you know, throughout the entire pandemic, like it was like 1 month after I arrived in Japan, the pandemic started, the lockdown began. So like
Yeah.
I honestly think I had a very, very different experience to the one that you guys had back at home in the UK. And because I'm not gonna lie to you, everything ran as normal in Japan. Like people just wore masks and just got on with work. Of course, we had a lockdown. 1 month things were closed, and as always, because that's the government for you. They were also having parties, you know, going out, drinking like they shouldn't be. Um, but everyone else was staying at home. And there have been a lot of cases of, you know, isolation. And in Japan, I think that people live alone anyway, and they're not very social in terms of like day-to-day activities. So like drinking parties are a really big thing in Japan for communication, not just at work, but between, you know, friends and things, and not having that really everything just kind of dampened down. And while we didn't have a 1 hour off, you know, like 1 hour a day type thing, people just didn't go out. No one
Yeah.
was going anywhere. The malls looked like ghost towns. And fair enough, I understand that people were scared, but it's been, like you said, material culture isn't going to show the things that didn't happen, which is people not going out. So like we're not going to know how people felt isolating themselves at home. It's just going to be the same. Instead of, you know, one takeout packet, it's going to be five. That's about it, really. But that's so
Yes.
interesting. I'm so sad to hear about that old man. Oh my God.
I mean, that's just one example. I could give other anecdotes where, you know, I saw people, and there was a lot of the other extreme of people trying to manage other people and pass judgment. I tried to,
Yeah.
you know, like most people, most normal people, try and navigate between the overly pompous and the, but you know, you also saw people that were just flagrantly, the youth didn't care, they were just walking around, and
Yeah.
and it's affecting shop workers who are on the front line dealing with this, and the disrespect shown to people just trying to do their job. So it's, you know, it was a tense time, and it still is a tense time. And in relation to the fact that it was always about politics, about trying to manage a pandemic, about
Yeah.
when and how different governments decided what to do. There was always local different. I mean, we had the Welsh English as an example, contrast of regulations and implementation. But then the end of the pandemic is, you know, as you say, I mean, we've still got kind of COVID-19. There's still people dying. We're up to, was it 207,000 people of excess deaths in the UK from COVID. And we have to think of that as a tip of a broader iceberg of people who are suffering long-term effects of COVID. The pandemic and its impact hasn't gone away on our health, on our hospitals, on our society. And I think there's a lot of COVID denial now. There's a lot of, well, that happened, now we're back to normal. And I think that's another aspect of material culture rhetoric. The very fact people are writing papers about it as if it is already the past.
But it's
I'm not
not.
saying that's part of the problem. They should be doing it, but I think it does reveal a bigger issue we have with our society of, oh, well, that was a problem. Like we do this with anything. Well, that was a war. That's over now. Well, what about the 100,000 maimed? What about all the, what about all the lost and missing? What about the infrastructure? What about the cities that are completely devastated? And the world moves on, the news moves on, and it's 2 decades later you'll have a special insight report of what is it life like now at that place where everyone was paying attention to for 2 months in 1996 or whenever it was, and now we go back, and it must be so, that must leave people behind and feel. So I wonder whether this research there's a function to this research. This is a question I don't think anyone's addressed. Is there a research of social restitution, of social healing, of by actually involving people in this research, of actually engaging people in community engagement with COVID projects to make them see how archaeology can tell them about this topic, but also how by discussing it through a material lens, through looking at it as archaeology, could help people deal with something that was very personal and start to see how it impacted across the world in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think it's interesting because there are a few times that it's COVID has been mentioned as a war type situation, and Critchell actually touches on this during her paper, and how we, like, in the UK we needed the NHS. Of course, in the other across the world, everyone needed their medical specialists and stuff, and we don't really see them as people because their lives are also impacted very heavily with COVID, and we're just like, yeah, there are heroes, and yes, of course they are, but how are they affected? And I hope that material culture can show that, but I don't really know if it can. Like you said, it's kind of gone. And how many, what was it? One of the papers, I can't remember. It was the exact quote, but it was having somebody with COVID come into the hospital is basically signing off a suicide note for the rest of the patients there. And I think we need to really think about statements like that, because it's not for us who are, or for people who are unaffected by COVID, or greatly unaffected by COVID, I should say. We don't really know the heartbreak of losing somebody, because for us it might just be a number, but they're not just numbers. They are people who died, who had families, who had friends and personal lives that were taken away from them. And I think that is sad, and very much like a war, which I really don't really think that we should be talking about COVID like a war, but there we go.
But it was the rhetorical. I mean, so just to explain, in a paper which I should have said is in J. Pettit edited book called COVID-19, the Second World War and the Idea of Britishness, pages 217 to 246, published by Peter Lang. In her article, Critchell is talking about the rhetoric used by politicians, that the very generation that was being abandoned, who lived through the Second World War, were being abandoned to die in care homes, including the author's own grandmother, were the people we've put on a pedestal as the greatest generation, lived through the Second World War, that they were being abandoned by people, conservative government, spouting the very rhetoric of, it's a war, we're coming through this together, the fight is over, the fight is won, as Boris Johnson tried to put him up as some Tin Pot Churchill, put himself up as some Tin Pot Churchill on a, and that's why, while we obviously we shouldn't be, it's not just we shouldn't be likening it to a war, but she charts how that rhetoric was so deeply grotesque and perverse, and how it actually, the disrupted grief affected how funerals were conducted, how landscapes were utilized, and how where and then she poses the question of where we are going next, because how are we going to come back from this? And she talks about the Viral Archive project, which is one archaeological project ongoing from the University of Warwick, Cork and UCL, looking at sites and symbols in social media and both, evidence of resilience, evidence of resistance to go measures, as well as the measures themselves being put in and materialized. So I think, she really poses, where do we go next with this? She ends with this: as a society adjusts to the so-called new normal, individuals, local communities and government officials need to be cautious of the long-term legacy of and damage to the individual and collective psyche that this fracturing of grief will have inevitably caused, and to consider the question of how this collective trauma can be managed in the future. And I think, for me, I think what she's saying is that the Second World War was a very crap plaster over that grief and disrupted funerals, and it was just used, let's all come together, and just like in the war. But there's yet to be any concerted engagement with what comes next and what we're doing with this. So I think both papers set up really important questions, and I think this is one of the areas where both historians and archaeologists are going to be show their worth in addressing contemporary issues, I think, really well.
Yeah, I think so. I hope so. Yeah, I mean, I think so, but I definitely hope so. It's a really tough one, I think, when it comes to this topic, because I think that everyone's just been affected by it so differently. Some people don't even care about it anymore. Like, I was talking to a friend the other day, and they were like, yeah, there's no COVID here. She lives in America. It's like, it's over. It's done. Like, it doesn't exist anymore. There's no masks. There's no concept of that. And it's interesting because for me, COVID is not over. Like, we are still talking about it here in Japan. It's very much ongoing. We still wear masks everywhere, and it is very important that we do. Like, you will be shunned if you don't wear one on a train or whatever. Like, it is that lifestyle, and it's interesting to get every, like, I mean, for especially for Critchell, it seems like a very personal account. And I of course, may everyone who died of COVID rest in peace. That is very important to say, because it isn't, I mean, death is death, and I think it's really important that we recognize that that is, of course, a very sad time for a lot of people. But as COVID as archaeology, or even as for history, it is interesting how ceremonies like, and I forgot the word. What's the word?
Funerals?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Sorry, I didn't know. I thought you meant to something more specific then. Okay, go on.
Sorry. Like, ceremonies like that have been, because of course weddings and things have been delayed. Things have,
Yes,
like,
of
that
course.
have, yeah, many of them have.
All
But
rites of passage, yeah.
yeah, but I do feel for some reason funerals are a lot. You can't really delay a funeral that much. I mean,
No.
like, it's important to grieve at a certain time. And I think a lot of people missed out on that because of COVID. Not being able to
Yes.
even say goodbye to loved ones is the hardest.
Yes, absolutely.
And I do hope that, I mean, I guess it's hard because it's not really material culture, but I do hope that this does get recognized in the archaeological landscape, and that people were
Yes.
unable to communicate with those who died of COVID, not being able to go to hospital beds or whatever, and maybe not even being able to attend funerals. Like, who are you? Are you a close relative, or are you just a friend? Because if you're just a friend, you get knocked off the list, and it's like, doesn't, it can be so much more than that. So yeah, like, I'm really interested in where this will go with archaeology, and how people will communicate about it in the future.
Certainly one of my interests is the actual physical spaces of cemeteries, crematoria and churchyards, and how they've been used. And I've already just published on papers about the long-term trend towards cremation, towards more ephemeral and personalized memorialization, and how old historic spaces can be reactivated and reutilized for contemporary communities in meaningful ways. And I think it's going to, I actually don't think COVID-19 is going to be a watershed of change. I think it's very much allowed a lot of the digital and the ephemeral material culture emphases of the last 50 years really have been um, have allowed, just in the same way that Teams was already there and Zoom was already there and could have been used, but no one did. I think a lot of those technologies and choices and trends of more cenotaphic, in the absence of the body, cenotaphic funerary traditions have already taken us in a place where COVID could be managed. I'm not saying it was managed effectively. I think there were gross failures. But my point is, managed in terms of the grief. I think the trajectory was set to allow it to be easier than it could have been. And Japan, likewise, which is a mainly cremating nation.
Yes.
But So I think it was more disrupting for some than others, depending on whether they were adhering to more traditional, localized. And what we haven't had is the comparative analysis, because obviously ethnic minorities in the UK were adversely affected health-wise, but we haven't had the I haven't seen the research, I haven't looked yet, but so maybe it's already being done to look at how Jewish communities, Muslim communities, other religious minorities for whom the grave, a Roman Catholic, for whom the grave is much more important and has traditionally been, how were they affected as opposed to a more secular, I'm not saying a uniform, a whole variety of other groups, including Hindus, Sikhs who cremate the dead, but who don't emphasize, they have deeply felt beliefs and care for the dead, but they don't have that emphasis on the grave, that particularly Jews, Muslims, and some Christian groups do. And I think that is really worthy of further investigation in a multicultural secular nation. Not only was there differentiation in who got hospital care, who died, and people of color, differentially, particularly black people, differentially affected because of various, ongoing, well, there's a whole debate about whether there was any predisposition, or it was simply lack of access to necessary healthcare. But I won't get into that. But my point is, it also affects the dead. There's inequalities affecting the dead too, as well as children, because of course children were not the target group, but children did die. Children also perished, particularly when it started hitting in the second wave. And that is something that I think needs more investment. Very sensitive topic, but infant and child death has always been a sensitive area. But for a pandemic that mainly affected elderly people, that doesn't mean there weren't any children victims of this disease. And so understanding that variety of the identities of the dead and the identities of the communities mourning, is a really big task for which archaeologists can work with historians and anthropologists and sociologists and geographers. I think it's going to be a really rich interdisciplinary field of study that's going to hopefully go on for many decades. But hopefully we can actually see an end to COVID. But I don't think we will. I think this is going to be another round of things in a few years. But whether lessons are learned or not, anyway.
No, I actually think that's a really interesting point, because coming from a Muslim background, it is of course, maybe my mom has friends, my parents, people died, things happen. But the interesting thing when you touched on that was, for me, I remember when everyone started wearing masks, and the first thing my mom said to me was, so wearing a mask is okay, but wearing a niqab is not okay.
Yeah, all the decades of, sorry to interrupt, but all that decades of rhetoric and antagonism are suddenly out the window. That must have been felt, well, the phrase bloody rich or hypocritical must have been, yeah, okay, go on. Yeah.
No, yeah, exactly. My mom felt, of course, she was very offended by it. I mean, she doesn't wear a niqab anyway, but, parents, they like to complain sometimes, and that's okay. Everyone likes to complain sometimes. But it was really interesting because as somebody who wears a mask every day, I wear a mask to work, I wear it outside, I go to the supermarket. I actually found a lot of comfort in wearing one, and I feel uncomfortable taking it off in public. It's a really nice screen for you, as a self-conscious type situation. But for a religious point of view, going back to the religious point of view, it is really interesting because it's basically the same thing, apart from, I guess, one is for religious purposes and the other one is more medical. But at that time, there was no difference. When everyone was wearing a mask, there is no difference whether if you're wearing a niqab and you're wearing a mask underneath it, or you're just wearing a mask. Half of your face is covered. The only thing I can see is your eyes. That's literally it. And I think a lot of Muslims might have had felt offended and felt hurt by how welcoming wearing a mask was. Because I know that certainly took off.
The emotions, the moralities, the rhetorics, it's all fascinating. And the mask became personalized, people's choices of message, jokey, serious, political. There's so much to be said, medical, people who don't, and then of course the comedy about people who couldn't wear it and had to wear it half off one ear or over their nose but not over their mouth, or over their mouth, and there was sort of comedy aspects to watching people struggling to do something so remedial and basic for most people. And then people with genuine anxieties about breathing, and I'm someone who's an asthma sufferer, and I actually agree with you. I felt a lot of comfort from wearing a mask because I don't particularly like my face, but also and I feel better that no one has to see it. But then on the other side of things, I also felt a bit of anxiety about breathing because I don't like restriction across my mouth, even if it's irrational, even if doctors can go on and say you're getting the same amount of oxygen in, I still feel that constriction, and I don't like that. So I see both sides of these things, but for most people it's not a major anxiety. But for people with mental and physical conditions, this can become a major problem of isolation and stress. And some people it's liberating, as you say. So
it's excellent. Like, oh, you're having a bad, like, you got a few like spots on your face that you don't like. I personally have acne. I was like, this is absolutely wonderful. I am loving this. Like, for every photo, everyone's like, take your mask off. I'm like, no, no, no. I'm social distancing. I'm sorry, guys. I'll just stand over here with my mask on. For me, it was very, very liberating.
Howard, you decided to take it wear a bucket for the next 10 years. Yes, it's absolutely just
Great.
because of the pandemic. It's nothing to do with it. No, but yeah, I know that's really, really interesting. So this, I really think I'm going to try and I'm going to be teaching a course in previous years. This year I'm not teaching it, but next year I'm going to go back to teaching my level 5 second year course, the Contemporary Past. And I asked the students last year a question about COVID-19, and only a few of them picked it. But next year I'm going to do multiple classes on this, and there's more literature out, so I can really I can do a disease and pandemic section of the course. So I'm really, so well done to the authors of these papers, because I'm going to be using them for my teaching. It's fantastic.
I think it's really nice to see that people are already beginning to write about it, and I think that's the most important thing, because it is such a big part of all of our lives, and I think that there will be a lot more material culture to come. So I am looking forward to reading a lot more papers about it. So I hope that your classes don't get bored of the whole COVID situation, and they can, enjoy writing and reading about it, because it is very interesting. I don't know personally, but yeah, very interesting.
Well, it's been a good chat. Thank you. I've really enjoyed that, and thank you for your personal insights. And there's so many elements, and we can't regurgitate the entire papers, but I hope that's been of use as a conversation for people, to get people into the archaeology of COVID-19,
Absolutely.
And whatever comes next. So thank you very much, Afnan. Is there anything else we need to reflect on before we depart?
Not that I can think of. I mean, I'm sure there's 101 things that we may have probably missed out from the papers, but I mean, please read them if you are interested in them. They are very interesting papers. So like, yeah, go ahead, take a look at them and see what your opinions are for yourselves. Yeah, that's about it.
And I was going to say, I'll add to the other links, other papers I'm aware of, to the description, so that people can. These are only two of a broader range. But thank you, Afnan, and thank you for listening, everyone.
Thank you. See you next time.